What 444 really means when life feels uncertain, the pattern that keeps finding you again. You weren't looking for it. You weren't thinking about numbers or signs or anything like that. You were just living your life, or trying to, and there it was, on your phone at 4:44 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come, on a receipt, on a street number you passed without meaning to look up, and something in you stopped, not because you decided to take it seriously, because something in you already had. That pause you feel when you see it, that's not superstition, that's recognition. And here's what nobody talks about when they explain this number. 444 doesn't appear when your life feels good. It doesn't show up during your clearest, most grounded, most certain moments. It shows up when something inside you is quietly unraveling, when a relationship has shifted into something you no longer recognize, when the version of your life you carefully built has started feeling like it belongs to someone else. When you're not broken, but you're not okay either. When you can feel that something has already ended, even though nothing around you has officially confirmed it yet. That is exactly when 444 finds you, every time. Most people search for a quick answer, find something about angels and divine protection, feel briefly better, and move on. But the feeling doesn't last, because that explanation, as comforting as it is, doesn't reach deep enough to touch what you're actually going through. If anything, it raises more questions. Why does a sign of protection keep appearing during your most painful and uncertain moments? If something is watching over you, why does everything still feel so unstable? Why does this number feel so specific to your situation when millions of other people are seeing it too? Those questions deserve real answers. Not comfort. Answers. Because 444 has a precise energetic signature, one that is directly connected to a very specific kind of life experience. The kind where the ground beneath you is shifting. The kind where something that used to define you is losing its shape. The kind where you are caught between what was and what hasn't arrived yet, suspended in a space that feels equal parts terrifying and strangely meaningful. What you're about to understand is not just what 444 means. It's why it keeps finding you at this exact moment in your life. Why the timing is never accidental. Why the uncertainty you're feeling and the number you keep seeing are not two separate things, but two expressions of the same transformation already in motion. This isn't reassurance, this is a decoding. And by the time it's complete, the way you see everything you've been experiencing is going to change. Why uncertainty activates the pattern. There's something that happens to you when life becomes uncertain. Something that goes beyond stress, beyond anxiety, beyond the ordinary discomfort of not knowing what comes next. Your senses sharpen, your awareness expands. Things you would normally walk past without a second thought suddenly catch your attention. A song lyric that feels too precise. A conversation overheard that answers a question you hadn't spoken out loud. A number that keeps appearing in places you weren't looking. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't madness. It's biology meeting something far older than biology. When the psychological structures that normally organize your experience, your sense of identity, your plans, your relationships, your understanding of where you're going, begin to loosen or collapse, the mind shifts into a different mode of perception. The filtering system that usually screens out irrelevant information relaxes. And in that relaxed state, patterns that were always present but invisible begin to surface. The mind, searching for stable ground, reaches outward for signals. It becomes, in the truest sense of the word, a receiver. This is why 444 intensifies during uncertain periods. Not because the number appears more frequently, but because you become capable of perceiving it in a way you simply weren't before. The uncertainty itself is what opens the channel. Ancient traditions understood this. Every major spiritual lineage in human history describes a state of inner emptying, a dissolution of certainty, as a prerequisite for deeper perception. The mystics called it different names. The Desert Fathers called it the dark night. The Buddhists called it groundlessness. The Taoists described it as returning to the uncarved block. but they were all pointing at the same experience, the moment when your ordinary sense of control dissolves, and something more essential becomes visible underneath it. You are in that moment right now, and 444 is one of the things becoming visible. But here's what's important to understand. The fact that uncertainty activates this perception doesn't make the perception less real. A radio receiver only picks up a signal when it's turned on. The signal was always broadcasting. The question was never whether it existed, only whether you were tuned in to receive it. Your uncertainty has turned you on, and what you're receiving is precise, intentional, and directly relevant to what you're moving through. The pattern isn't finding you despite your pain. It's finding you because of it. Because the version of you that exists inside this uncertainty is more open, more perceptive, and more ready to understand something true than the version of you that felt settled and in control ever was. 444 chose this moment for a reason, and that reason begins with the number itself, the architecture of 444. Before you can understand what 444 is telling you, you need to understand what it's built from, because this number is not arbitrary. It is not a random sequence that humans assigned meaning to out of spiritual wishful thinking. Its structure carries something, and when you see it clearly, the experience of encountering 444 stops feeling vague and starts feeling precise. Everything begins with the number 4. Across cultures, across centuries, across traditions that never had contact with one another, the number 4 has carried a consistent symbolic weight. In ancient Chinese cosmology, 4 represents the earth, stable, enduring, oriented by 4 cardinal directions. In the Western esoteric tradition, 4 corresponds to the 4 elements: fire, water, earth, air, the complete set of forces from which all physical reality is constructed. In Pythagorean numerology, 4 is the number of manifestation, the point at which something moves from invisible potential into concrete form. In Native American traditions, the 4 sacred directions form the foundation of ceremony, of navigation, of right relationship with the world. 4 is structure. 4 is foundation. 4 is the number of things that hold. Now triple it. 444 does not simply suggest structure, it insists on it. The repetition is not decoration. In numerological traditions, the tripling of a number amplifies its core quality to its maximum expression while simultaneously signaling urgency. Seeing 444 is not a gentle reminder. It is an emphatic, repeated, urgent transmission of the same message delivered 3 times in a row. The foundation holds. The foundation holds. The foundation holds. And there is something else embedded in this number that most people miss entirely. When you reduce 444 numerologically, 4 plus 4 plus 4, you arrive at 12. Reduce 12, and you arrive at 3. 3 is the number of creation, of synthesis, of the point where 2 opposing forces produce something new. Hidden inside the structural stability of 444 is the seed of creation. The foundation is not the endpoint. It is the ground from which something new is being built. This is the full architecture of what you keep seeing. Not just protection, not just reassurance. A precise symbolic message that says, even as things around you feel unstable, a foundation is forming. Even as the old structure dissolves, the new one is already encoded in the frequency of what you're receiving. The number itself is not describing your present circumstances. It is describing what is being constructed beneath them. You are not standing on nothing. You just can't see the ground yet. When the ground disappears, you know the feeling. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. It arrives quietly, usually in an ordinary moment, sitting in your car, lying awake at 3 a.m. in the middle of a conversation that should feel normal but doesn't. And what it brings is this: the quiet, undeniable sense that something you relied on is no longer there in the way it used to be. It might be a relationship, not necessarily one that ended loudly. Sometimes the most destabilizing losses are the ones that dissolve slowly, where the person is still present, but the connection has quietly changed into something unrecognizable. You reach for what used to be there and your hand finds air. It might be a version of yourself, the identity you built around a role, a purpose, a set of beliefs that once felt certain, and then one day, without warning, those beliefs stopped generating the feeling of certainty they used to. The role stopped feeling like you. The purpose stopped pulling you forward. And you were left holding a life that fits on paper but feels borrowed. It might be a direction, a plan, a vision, a path that once seemed clear. And now the path is there, technically, but the internal compass that was pointing toward it has gone quiet. This is what it feels like when the ground disappears, not a fall, a dissolution. The difference matters. When you fall, something catches you. When the ground dissolves, you realize that what you thought was solid was always more fragile than it appeared, and that the solidity you felt was coming from inside you, not from the structure itself. 444 appears most intensely during this specific experience, and the reason is not that the universe is sending you comfort while you suffer. The reason is that this dissolution, as terrifying as it feels, is a known phase of a specific kind of transition, one that has a shape, one that has a direction, one that ends not in emptiness but in reconstruction. Every spiritual tradition that has mapped human transformation describes a phase of structural dissolution as essential, not incidental, to growth, not a detour from the path itself. The caterpillar does not transform by adding wings to its existing body. It dissolves almost entirely inside the chrysalis, its structure breaking down into something barely recognizable as alive, before the new form begins to take shape. What looks like destruction is actually the most active phase of the entire process. The ground disappearing beneath you is not evidence that you are lost. It is evidence that you have reached the phase of your transformation where the old ground was no longer capable of holding what you are becoming. 444 is not appearing to tell you that the old ground will come back. It is appearing to tell you that new ground is already forming, beneath the dissolution, beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty that has become so familiar, it almost feels like your permanent address. You are not homeless. You are mid-construction, and the number that keeps finding you is the energetic signature of the construction itself. The psychological layer. At some point, a part of your mind pushes back. It has to, because you are a rational person, and rational people don't simply accept that a repeating number sequence carries personal meaning, without at least asking the question, what if I'm just noticing it more because I want to? That question is worth sitting with, not because it disproves the experience, but because the honest answer to it actually deepens the meaning rather than diminishing it. Carl Jung spent decades studying a phenomenon he called synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence between an inner psychological state and an outer event that has no causal connection to it but carries unmistakable relevance. His research led him to a conclusion that was radical for a scientist of his standing. The psyche and the external world are not as separate as the modern mind assumes. When a person is undergoing deep psychological transformation, the boundary between inner and outer experience becomes more permeable. The unconscious mind, navigating its own reorganization, begins to recognize in the external world the patterns that mirror its internal process. In other words, you don't just notice 444 more because you want it to be meaningful. You notice it more because a part of you that operates below conscious awareness is in the process of restructuring. And that part of you recognizes in 444 a frequency that corresponds to what it is doing. This is not wishful thinking dressed up in academic language. This is the documented, observed behavior of the human psyche during periods of transformation. The mind undergoing significant change becomes a more sensitive instrument. It picks up signals it would normally filter out, not because those signals weren't there, but because the filter has loosened, and what was always broadcasting is finally being received. There is also a second psychological layer that deserves attention. When you are living through genuine uncertainty, when the structures that organize your sense of self are under pressure, the psyche begins looking for what Jungian analysts call a symbol of wholeness, something that carries the feeling of coherence, of completeness, of structural integrity, in a moment when your internal experience feels fragmented. 444, with its triple repetition of the most stable and grounding single digit, functions precisely as this kind of symbol. Your psyche doesn't select it arbitrarily. It recognizes it. So when you ask, "Is this real? Or am I just seeing what I want to see?" the honest answer is, the distinction matters less than you think. What is real is the transformation you're inside of. What is real is the perceptual shift that transformation has created. And what is real is that 444 has become, for you, a carrier of meaning that corresponds precisely to what your psyche is working through. The signal and the receiver found each other. That is not delusion. That is exactly how meaningful experience works. What 444 is actually protecting. When people first encounter the idea that 444 is a sign of protection, they interpret that word through the most immediate emotional lens available to them. Protection from what? From loss? From pain? From the relationship ending? The plan failing? The version of life they built coming apart? And when the loss happens anyway, when the pain arrives regardless, the idea of protection starts to feel hollow, like a promise that wasn't kept. But this interpretation misunderstands the nature of what 444 is protecting entirely. 444 is not protecting your circumstances. It is not a force field around your comfort, your current relationships, your existing plans, or the particular shape your life has taken up to this point. If it were, it would appear during peaceful times, not during disruption. The fact that it intensifies precisely when things are falling apart is the clearest possible signal that what it protects has nothing to do with the things that are falling. What 444 protects is your direction, not the specific path you mapped out, not the timeline you planned or the destination you imagined. Your direction, the underlying current of your life that runs beneath every plan, every relationship, every version of yourself you've inhabited. The thing that, when you're honest with yourself in your quietest moments, you can feel pulling you forward even when you don't know exactly where forward leads. This distinction is everything. Because a life can lose its shape entirely. Relationships can end, careers can dissolve, identities can shed. And the underlying direction can remain intact. More than intact. Clarified. The dissolution of the external structure doesn't destroy the current. It removes the obstacles that were misdirecting it. What you're being protected from is not pain. You're being protected from permanent derailment, from making a decision in the depths of your fear that takes you so far from your own current that finding your way back becomes genuinely difficult, from contracting so completely under the weight of uncertainty that you close off the very openings through which your next chapter is trying to arrive. 444 appears at the moments when that risk is highest, when you are most tempted to abandon the direction entirely. When the pain is loud enough to make you believe that the safest thing is to stop moving, to go back, to choose the familiar over the true. And what it says, in the precise, structural, triple-amplified language of its own architecture, is this: the direction is real. The foundation beneath it holds. Do not stop now. That is not a small protection. That is the most essential protection possible. Because you can rebuild circumstances. You can find new relationships, new paths, new external structures. What is much harder to recover is the thread back to your own direction once you've convinced yourself it was never real. 444 is making sure you don't lose that thread, even now, especially now. The hidden message inside the repetition. You've seen 4 before. You've probably seen 44. But what stops you, what creates that particular internal pause, is always the triple sequence. Always 444. And that specificity is not accidental. The repetition itself is a layer of the message that most interpretations skip over entirely. In virtually every numerological and symbolic tradition that has worked with repeated number sequences, repetition carries a meaning distinct from the meaning of the number being repeated. It is not simply amplification, though it is that too. Repetition signals a specific relationship between the message and the moment in which it is being delivered. A single 4 says, structure exists, foundation is present. 44 says, pay attention. The foundation is relevant to something happening in your life right now. 444 says something different from both of those. 444 says, this is urgent. This is being delivered at maximum intensity because the moment you are in requires it. The tripling is not decoration, it is calibration. The message is being matched to the magnitude of what you're living through. Think about that for a moment. The reason you're seeing 444 instead of 4 or 44 is because the intensity of what you're experiencing has called forth the most amplified version of this signal available. The number is responding to the weight of your transition. It is being delivered at the frequency that matches the depth of what is actually happening in your life. There is also something precise in the mathematics of the repetition. 3 is the number of synthesis, the point where two opposing forces generate something new. The tension between what was and what is becoming, between the old structure and the new one not yet visible, between the you who existed before this uncertainty and the you who is being shaped inside of it. That tension is a creative force. And 444, built on 3 4s, encodes that creative force directly into its structure. The message inside the repetition fully decoded sounds like this. The magnitude of what you're going through is real. It is being recognized. And encoded within the very intensity of this transition is the creative force that will build what comes next. You are not in an ordinary difficult period. You are in the kind of transformation that produces a fundamentally different life. The triple signal is the confirmation of that. 444 doesn't show up for small disruptions. It shows up when the reorganization is deep, structural, and significant. The repetition is not just emphasis. It is testimony. Testimony that what you're living through is as serious as it feels, and as meaningful as you secretly suspected it might be. The emotional paradox of protection. Here is the question that lives underneath everything else. The one that doesn't go away no matter how many reassuring explanations you encounter. If I am protected, why does this hurt so much? It is a fair question. It might be the most honest question in this entire video, and it deserves an answer that doesn't flinch. The short answer is this. Protection and pain are not opposites. They never were. The belief that they are is one of the most persistent and damaging misunderstandings of what spiritual protection actually means. Think of the most genuinely protective forces you have experienced in human form. A parent who told you a truth you didn't want to hear, because the comfortable lie would have sent you in the wrong direction. A teacher who refused to lower the standard when you wanted to be let off the hook, because they could see what you were capable of even when you couldn't. A period of loss that stripped away something you were clinging to, and in the stripping away, revealed something about yourself that the clinging had been hiding. None of those experiences felt protective in the moment. All of them were. The protection 444 carries operates on the same principle. It is not a force that removes difficulty from your path. It is a force that ensures the difficulty you are experiencing is purposeful, that it is producing something, building something, clearing something that needed to be cleared. It is the difference between suffering that wastes you and suffering that transforms you. Both feel like pain. Only one is going somewhere. The reason 444 appears most intensely during your most painful moments is precisely because those moments are the most critical junctures of the transition. The moments when the temptation to abandon the process, to escape the discomfort by returning to what was familiar, even if what was familiar was no longer true, is at its highest. The protection intensifies when the risk is greatest. The signal gets louder when you most need to hear it. There is also something else happening in these moments that is easy to miss. Pain, at the depth you may be experiencing it, is not just suffering. It is information. It is the psyche communicating with extraordinary precision about what matters, what has been lost, what is being asked to transform. The sharpness of the pain is proportional to the depth of the attachment, and the depth of the attachment is often proportional to the depth of the truth that is being reorganized. You do not grieve things that don't matter. The intensity of what you feel is evidence of how real this is, How much of yourself has been invested in what is now transforming? That is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something that genuinely mattered is being handled with the seriousness it deserves. 444. Appearing in the middle of that pain is not irony. It is precision. It is the signal showing up exactly where the support is most needed. Not to eliminate the pain, but to ensure that the pain is not the final word. What needs to be released? Somewhere in the quiet, underneath all the uncertainty, you already know. You don't want to know. Knowing makes it real, and real means having to do something about it. But you know. There is something in your life that has already ended. Not dramatically, not officially, not in a way that anyone else would necessarily recognize from the outside, but internally, in the place where you actually live, something has completed its cycle, and you have been holding on to it anyway. This is not a judgment. It is one of the most human things that exists. The gap between what has already ended on the inside and what we are still maintaining on the outside. We hold on because releasing something real requires grieving it, and grieving it means fully acknowledging that it is gone. And sometimes the loss is so woven into who we thought we were that releasing it feels less like letting go of a thing and more like letting go of a self. 444 has a particular relationship with this moment, the moment of necessary release. It appears with unusual frequency around the threshold where the internal knowing can no longer be held at a distance. Where the gap between what is true and what you are still pretending is true becomes too wide to maintain without a cost that is no longer worth paying. The discomfort you have been feeling, the specific quality of uncertainty that brought you to a video like this one, is not only the pain of transition. Some of it is the exhaustion of the holding, the energetic cost of keeping something alive inside you that has already finished, the continuous effort of sustaining a story that no longer matches the reality your deeper self is navigating. Release in this context does not mean indifference. It does not mean pretending something didn't matter or moving on before you've genuinely processed what it meant. Release means allowing the truth of what has already happened to be fully real. It means letting the grief come, which paradoxically is the only way to let it pass. It means saying, internally, clearly, without the softening qualifications we use to protect ourselves from the full weight of loss. This has ended, and it was real, and I am going to let it be over. That moment of release, when it genuinely happens, creates something that no amount of holding on ever could. It creates space, not emptiness, space. A space that has the particular quality of something that has been cleared rather than abandoned. A space that feels, even in its rawness, like the first breath of something true. 444 appears around this threshold because this is precisely where the transition requires the most support. Not the support of comfort, the support of courage, the courage to stop maintaining what has already ended, the courage to let the truth of completion be real, so that the reality of what is beginning can finally have room to arrive. What needs to be released is not a small thing. It never is when 444 is involved. But the weight of what you've been carrying, the weight of the holding, the pretending, the sustaining, is heavier than the grief that release will bring. And on the other side of that grief is something you haven't been able to access while your hands were still full. Let it be over. It is already over. 444 has been trying to tell you that for longer than you realize. Building on unstable ground. One of the most disorienting aspects of genuine transition is the in-between, not the ending. The ending, however painful, has a certain terrible clarity to it. And not the new beginning. The new beginning, when it finally arrives with enough definition to be recognized, carries its own momentum. The in-between is something else entirely. The in-between is where you are right now. You have released something, or you are in the process of releasing it. The old structure is no longer intact, and the new one is not yet visible. There is nothing to hold on to in the obvious way, and the absence of something to hold on to creates a particular kind of fear that is unlike ordinary fear. It is not the fear of a specific outcome. It is the fear that there might not be an outcome, that the in-between might not be a passage to somewhere, that it might simply be where you are now, indefinitely, on ground that has no stability and no name. This is the fear that 444 speaks to most directly in this phase of the transition, because here is what is actually happening during the in-between, underneath the invisibility of it. Foundation is being laid, not metaphorically, structurally. The groundlessness you feel is not evidence of nothing being formed. It is evidence of something being formed at a level deeper than what you can currently perceive. The foundation of what comes next is not built on top of your existing life. It is built beneath it, in the space created by the release, in the quiet after the ending, in the part of you that even in the middle of not knowing keeps moving slightly forward, keeps making one small authentic choice after another, keeps orienting itself towards something true even when the shape of that truth hasn't arrived yet. Those movements are the construction. Every moment you choose honesty over performance. Every moment you resist the pull back to what was familiar but no longer true. Every moment you sit inside the discomfort of not knowing instead of grasping for a premature answer. That is a brick being placed. That is foundation being built in real time, invisibly, in the exact space where the old ground used to be. The instability is not the problem. The instability is the medium in which the new structure takes form. Just as bone remodels through stress, the microscopic fractures created by pressure triggering the cells that build stronger, denser bone, the instability you are experiencing is triggering the formation of a foundation that your old circumstances never required you to build. You are not weaker in this period. You are being made more structurally sound than you have ever been. The 444 that keeps appearing around you is not just a signal of protection. It is, in a very real sense, a readout of the construction in progress, the energetic signature of a foundation forming beneath your feet in the dark. You cannot see it yet, but it is there. And when it becomes visible, when the new ground finally solidifies enough to be felt, you will understand why it had to be built this way, why it required the dissolution of the old, why the in-between, however long and however uncomfortable, was not wasted time. It was building time, and it is still building now. The quiet turning point. Nobody tells you how undramatic the actual turning point is. You spend so long inside the uncertainty, so long navigating the dissolution and the in-between, that you develop a kind of unconscious expectation that when the shift finally comes, it will announce itself, that there will be a moment of unmistakable clarity, a revelation, a sign so obvious it requires no interpretation, a feeling of certainty that arrives like weather changing and leaves no room for doubt. And then the turning point comes. And it is nothing like that. It happens in an ordinary moment, not during a dramatic confrontation or a significant event. In the car on the way to somewhere unremarkable, in the shower, in the space between one thought and the next before sleep. And what happens is almost imperceptible. Something releases, very quietly, in a place you can't quite locate. A decision forms, not declared, not announced, just present, where before there was only uncertainty. A direction reemerges, not with the force of revelation, but with the quiet authority of something that was always true returning to a state of being acknowledged. And you almost miss it, because it doesn't feel like enough. After everything you've been through, it doesn't feel proportional to the weight of the transition. It feels too small to be the thing. But this is the turning point. This quiet, almost invisible internal shift. This is what 444 has been marking all along. The reason the turning point is quiet is because the real work of the transition was never external. It was internal. Everything that needed to dissolve, dissolved. Everything that needed to be released was released, or is being released. Everything that needed to be rebuilt at the foundation level was rebuilt. In the dark, invisibly, over all those weeks and months of uncertainty that felt like nothing was happening. The quiet turning point is quiet, because it is the natural completion of a process that was already finished. The internal reorganization has been underway the entire time. The turning point is simply the moment when enough of it is complete that the surface of your experience can begin to reflect it. 444 appears with particular frequency around this threshold, the threshold of the quiet turning point, for a reason that is now, in context, completely clear. The number built on the foundation of 4, tripled in urgency, carrying the hidden creative synthesis of 3 at its core. This number is the energetic signature of exactly this moment. The moment when the foundation that was built in the dark becomes the ground you are standing on. The moment when the transition that felt endless reveals itself to have been, all along, moving toward something. You may have already passed through this turning point without recognizing it for what it was. You may be standing at its threshold right now. Either way, what matters is understanding what it means. Not that everything is resolved, not that the uncertainty is over, not that the new life has fully arrived, but that the direction has been restored. The current is moving again. And what comes next is an emergence, not a survival. You have turned, even if you haven't fully felt it yet. What comes after 444? You came to this video looking for an explanation of a number, but if what has been explored here has landed in the way it was intended, what you've found is something larger than an explanation. You've found a map of the territory you've been living inside, one that gives shape and direction to an experience that, from the inside, has often felt shapeless and directionless. So what comes after 444? The honest answer is, not the end of uncertainty, at least not immediately. Transformation does not deliver you from uncertainty into perfect clarity in one clean movement. What it delivers you into is a different relationship with uncertainty, one where the not knowing no longer feels like evidence that something has gone wrong, one where the groundlessness of transition is recognized for what it is, a passage, not a destination, rather than feared as a permanent address. What comes after 444 is a quieter version of yourself, not quieter in the sense of diminished, quieter in the sense of settled at a deeper level than you were before this began. The anxious noise that characterized the height of the transition, the constant self-questioning, the searching for certainty, the hypervigilance around signs and signals, gradually gives way to something that is harder to name, but unmistakable when it arrives. A kind of bedrock knowing. Not certainty about what will happen, certainty about who you are and what direction you're moving in. The signs don't disappear after this, but they change in quality. 444 continues to appear, but when it does, it no longer carries the urgency of a message being delivered to someone who needs convincing. It carries the quality of confirmation. Not hold on, the foundation holds. But yes, you know this. You are standing on it. What also comes after 444 is an expanded capacity for the kind of experience that brought you here. You will not move through this transition and return to the same perceptual sensitivity you had before it. The period of uncertainty opened something in the way you receive the world. And that opening, once made, doesn't close completely. You will continue to notice, to feel the significance in the precise arrival of certain moments, to recognize, in the patterns that repeat around you, a language that is speaking specifically to your experience. You have become, through this process, a more sensitive and accurate instrument. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most significant gifts that transformation, the painful, disorienting, groundless kind, reliably delivers to the people willing to move through it rather than around it. And finally, what comes after 444 is the life that has been forming beneath everything that dissolved. The relationships that are truer than the ones that completed. The sense of purpose that is more authentically yours than the one you inherited. The version of yourself that was always underneath the accumulated layers of what you thought you were supposed to be, now visible, now operative, now no longer submerged beneath the weight of what had to dissolve for it to surface. That life is not waiting somewhere in the future. It has been assembling itself throughout every moment of the uncertainty you've lived through. Every release, every quiet turning point, every night you stayed with the discomfort instead of escaping it, all of it was construction. All of it was the new life taking shape in the exact space the old one was vacating. 444 was never just a sign of protection. It was the energetic signature of your own transformation, reflected back to you in a form your waking mind could recognize and your deeper knowing could respond to. You were never lost. You were building, and what you've been building, through the dissolution, through the in-between, through the quiet turning point, through all of it, is the most authentic version of the life you came here to live. That's what comes after 444. That's what was always coming.